It looks like we're going to have a policy-free election campaign from the Labour Party, and that just isn't good enough. It's lazy and it's arrogant. Perhaps they've decided that policy runs the risk of actually having to do something. The Prime Minister has said that they're going to fight the election on the basis that they did a good job during the Chinese plague. She also made a bizarre reference to a Netflix show in launching her campaign. But did they? That's why they're scaremongering on community transmission and masks. Their poor performance on past promises is also why they don't want to campaign on their achievements. There are precious few of those. Sadly, the media are letting Jacinda Ardern get away with it all. And with her army of COVID Karens telling everyone off who dares criticise, we're fast losing any semblance of robust political debate. That's why we ask the hard questions and draw your attention to the yawning gap between Labour's slogans and promises and their actual delivery. I'm Cam Slater, and this is Insight Politics. This week, both Chris Hipkins and Ashley Bloomfield gave ominous warnings of being prepared for a second wave of the Chinese plague.
Finally, the use of face masks. The Ministry of Health has updated its advice on the use of masks by the public as part of our ongoing response to COVID-19. We've seen elsewhere that masks can play a role in helping us to reduce the spread of COVID-19 when worn by the public where there are cases of community transmission. I want to restate here, there are currently no cases of community transmission in New Zealand. The World Health Organization suggests that people should be prepared for the use of masks before the need to use them arises. So the Ministry is now recommending that as part of our collective preparations for any future outbreak of COVID-19, households add sufficient masks for everybody normally resident in their household to their emergency supply kits. Just as we are prepared by having food and water set aside in the event of a natural disaster, we are encouraging New Zealanders to have a supply of masks set aside at home in the event of a further COVID-19 outbreak.
Amongst their recent pronouncements was both giving advice to citizens stockpiling masks at home and how to wear masks. Ashley Bloomfield even gave us a demonstration video of him talking about masks and how to wear them and even how to make them.
You will have heard the announcement yesterday by the Minister of Health, Honourable Chris Hipkins, that we're encouraging New Zealanders as part of our being prepared for COVID-19 and as part of our response to get some face masks and have them as part of your kit at home for when we may need to use them if we get COVID-19 back in the community. You also heard me say a couple of days ago, it's more a matter of when rather than if. So being prepared is what Alert Level 1 is all about.
Either they're aware of something that they haven't shared with us about community transmission, or it's just scare tactics. Either way, it is in stark contrast with what both Bloomfield and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern were telling us in May. One News reported that masks will not be required to be worn by members of the public when the country moves from Level 2 on May the 12th.
So we're not requiring masks on public transport. The updated evidence review you've seen, and there is updated advice around PPE and including mask use for health workers, for some workers in very specific settings outside of health, and also for the general public. But for the general public, what I can say is we're neither recommending nor requiring masks. However, if you do choose to use a mask, that's fine. And just make sure you know how to use it safely so that you reduce the risk to yourself and others. It's not a supply issue, it's an evidence issue, and what I would say is the evidence is very much in the balance, and that's why you will find various learned commentators reaching different positions on this very issue. That doesn't mean that's our final position, and we will keep watching. But at the moment, we're not requiring or recommending that the general public use masks.
Surgical mask, it'll be surprising to many to learn a surgical mask, for instance, should be changed up to 3 times an hour. And of course, when you're changing it, you need to be very careful that you're not making any contact with the mask and ultimately that you're not allowing it to become damp through the entire period you're wearing it. And so making sure that it's worn properly, I think is one of the reasons evidence really can often fall on either side when you're asking those outside of the health profession to wear them.
So what's changed? Why all the talk of possibly requiring masks? Are we about to get locked down again? These numpties take everything WHO says is gospel. No one has yet held them to account for being China's mouthpiece in the early stages. And while our government is tugging their forelock in obedience to WHO, public health officials in Denmark, Holland and beyond say they have no intention of recommending face coverings, saying the science does not support it. Koen Berends, spokesman for the National Institute of Public Health and the Environment, said, "Face masks in public places are not necessary, based on all current evidence. And there is no benefit and there may even be negative impact. So who do we believe? But if we do now need masks, then that raises some interesting questions the media are failing to ask. If it is the case that there will be community transmission, then clearly the stamp it out and eliminate strategy that the Prime Minister has been claiming as a personal victory has failed. So too has their border and quarantine strategy. They can't have it both ways. Either they've done as they claimed and eliminated the virus, or they've failed and we have community transmission again. I'll just bet that we go into level 2 24 hours after the sentencing of the Aussie scumbag and the resulting headlines and hugging photos, such as the craven personal publicity agenda of one of the most shallow prime ministers in living history. At their campaign launch, Ardern made it official that they aren't going to campaign on policy, they're going to campaign on their response to the Chinese plague, thereby ignoring all their policy failures and broken promises from the last election. Which means they're going to essentially bore us to death by telling us all how they went hard and they went early. And as I wrote on Sunday, Jacinda Ardern has famously claimed that we will know us by our deeds. I examined their deeds in housing and they were found wanting. But the Prime Minister wants us to ignore all their policy failings and instead focus on their deeds during the Chinese plague response. Well, one of their first deeds was to lock us all down, and we now know that deed was also illegal. So their first action in response to the Chinese plague was to break the law, suspend and ignore civil rights, and then pass new laws under urgency or by orders in council to correct their deficiencies. Another deed was to borrow billions of dollars that makes John Key's borrowing, which Labour criticised roundly at the time, pale into obscurity. We now have a mountain of debt and a barely functioning economy. On top of that, their deeds in response to the plague has caused tens of thousands more people to become unemployed. And that mountain of debt used to pay wage subsidies has also conveniently postponed further redundancies until after the election. Labour have mortgaged your kids' future to win themselves re-election. Sadly, it might just work. They're banking on being able to fix everything in time for the following election. But given their lack of achievement in the past 3 years, that's highly unlikely. We know them by their deeds, and their deeds have seen a tripling of the waiting list for state housing instead of a lowering like they promised. If housing was a crisis before Labour came in, then surely that crisis is now 3 times worse. Rents have increased, costs and compliance to landlords has seen a mass exodus. KiwiBuild was supposed to have delivered 16,000 homes by now. It's delivered just 450. By any measure you care to choose, housing under Labour has gotten worse. Labour promised light rail to the airport by 2021, yet not 1 millimetre of track has been built. That's another spectacular failure by Phil Twyford, whose mouth cashed cheques his government couldn't deliver. Again, if we know them by their deeds, they've failed. Child poverty, the Prime Minister's own portfolio, and also the reason she stated for being in politics, has gone backwards. In 2017, the Prime Minister claimed she wanted New Zealand to be the best place in the world to be a child, and promised to halve child poverty. However, 3 years on, that promise has proven to be nothing more than a hollow slogan, as there are now 4,000 more children living in poverty under her watch. 7 out of 9 child poverty indicators have worsened, and there are now 15,000 more children growing up in benefit-dependent homes since Labor took office. In the last financial year, $480 million was paid out in hardship grants. Know them by their deeds. Another failure. Labor can't avoid being held to account, but it's up to the National Party to call them out as a party whose only deeds have been to make things worse in almost every respect. All they have are slogans. There's no policy depth to back up those slogans, and the results are what a technocrat would describe as subpar. Their stars are waning and overworked, and the rest of them are what a banker would call poorly performing assets. If Labor wins a majority, they'll have even more of those poorly performing assets on the backbench. Labor wants us to re-elect them based on what they've done, and from where I'm looking at it from, they've done 3/5 of 5/8 of stuff all. Will the voters realise that in time? Prime Minister launched Labor's re-election campaign on Saturday in a town hall decked out like it was from the depths of hell itself. It certainly looked like it was set up as some sort of religious ceremony in a satanic church kind of way. Then again, Labor has become a religion of sorts, with people seeking to beatify its leader as some sort of amazing miracle worker. That's certainly how the media party have treated her, especially the foreign media that she always has time for. She even believes all her own spin, but one day she's going to step out on some water and find that she can't walk on it. Ardern started her campaign with the strangest comment imaginable.
Now, if you told me then that our launch in 2020 would be in the midst of a global pandemic with our borders closed, I would have found that very hard to fathom. If you'd told me that Clark and I would by now have a toddler, I wouldn't have believed we would be so lucky. And if you'd told me that we would have just completed a term in government with both New Zealand First and the Greens, I'd assume you'd been watching excessive amounts of Stranger Things on Netflix. And yet, here we are.
And here we are, with the Prime Minister talking about Stranger Things. For those who don't know what Stranger Things was about, it's a Netflix show set in the 80s, where a secret Soviet laboratory under the local shopping mall seeks to open a gateway to the Upside Down, allowing the entities from the Upside Down to possess people in the towns and creating a new horror for them all to deal with. The lead character is a girl called 11, who gets a blood nose every time she uses her powers. Does Jacinda Ardern get a blood nose every time she uses her powers? Has New Zealand become the Upside Down under her government? Do we have to start calling her 11 now? Or even funnier, is Clark Gayford Billy? Or is it because Stranger Things was set in the 80s and she has a hankering for stroppy unions, massive state subsidies, and tariffs and government control over every aspect of our lives? Is she the new Muldoon who controlled New Zealand with an iron fist in the 70s and 80s? She sure as hell won't be thinking big, such as the timidity of her leadership and the paucity of her thinking. Though she may have something big to say, and that will be talking about the massive debt monster she has lumped us all with. Oh wait, just like the 70s and 80s. Maybe it's the big hair and shoulder pads she's hankering for. But the Upside Down has a massive evil monster with tentacles looking over the town, and smaller dog-like creatures called demogorgons marauding and devouring locals. Are the demogorgons the Chinese plague? Is the looming evil over the town the massive debt monster? In any case, it was a weird thing to begin your election campaign. I suppose we've seen a lot of strange things in the past 3 years, like a Prime Minister who seems to have enough time on her hands to watch 3 seasons of Stranger Things on Netflix. Get a load of this from Victoria's top cop.
The people, the vast majority who are doing the right thing, need to understand for those who aren't, there is a consequence. And there are consequences, and I want to be really clear on that. In the last week, we've seen a trend, an emergence, if you like, of groups of people, small groups, but nonetheless concerning groups who classify themselves as sovereign citizens, whatever that might mean, people who don't think the law applies to them. We've seen them at checkpoints, baiting police, not providing their name and address. On at least 3 or 4 occasions in the past week, we've had to smash the windows of people in cars and pull them out of there so they could provide their details because they weren't telling us where they were going. They weren't adhering to the Chief Health Officer guidelines. They weren't providing their name and their address. We don't want to be doing that, but people have to absolutely understand there are consequences for your actions, and if you're not doing the right thing, we will not hesitate to issue infringements, to arrest you, to detain you where it's appropriate. As I say, it's not something we want to be doing, but it is what we will do.
Sounds very corona fascist, not dissimilar to the threats we had here. It would surprise no one that this senior Australian policeman dressed from head to toe in black as he delivered his police state view of the world. As James Dalrymple said, this is not a scene from a prequel to Mad Max where Australia gets taken over by fascists. This is actually happening right now in the Australian state of Victoria under the regime of power-crazed and hard-left Premier Daniel Andrews, or Kim Jong-dan as he is known locally. Given the warnings this past week from both Chris Hipkins and Ashley Bloomfield, how far away are we from seeing our own police commissioner say the same things? And given the last lockdown was on seriously dodgy legal grounds, it makes you wonder if we aren't being softened up again for a lockdown shortly after the Aussie terrorist is locked away for life. The Prime Minister is going to campaign on her response to the Chinese plague. She claims to have saved us all, as do her COVID Karen army. But she forgets that she was the Prime Minister. It was literally her job. Blythe's statements about leading the response ignore the fact that any government was going to lead the response. The opposition could literally do nothing. And anyway, any approaches to help were rejected out of hand. The old political saying that politicians should never waste a good crisis has never been truer than today. So Labour and the Prime Minister are going to campaign on steady as she goes. They can hardly campaign on their achievements, can they? The left wing will try to portray Judith Collins as a mean girl, but it isn't mean to be competent, and it isn't kindness to let hundreds of thousands languish on the dole. This country needs more than hugs and cuddles, it needs competence. And I'm sorry, but Labour doesn't fill me with confidence despite the claims of their army of COVID Karens. Just look at the fools who have quit, been sacked or demoted. Know them by their deeds. Curran, Davis, Clark, Fitery, Twyford. Sacked, inept, useless, punchy and grandiloquent. 4 political pygmies and a caucus of equally useless MPs. Labour has just 3 people doing any work. Robertson, Woods and Farfoy, with Jacinda playing the fairy princess and uttering word soup and bumper sticker slogans. I'm sick of hearing hard and early team of 5 million. Last I looked, there's no I in team, and I'm certainly not playing on their team either. We need a proper campaign, one where leaders treat us like adults, not like naughty kids with the ever-present threat that Mother Ardern will send us to our rooms if we don't comply. We live in a democracy. We deserve a proper election campaign. I'm Cam Slater, and this was Insight Politics.